So reporting on the first full day of testimony in the trial of Ghislane Maxwell, the first witness that the state called to the stand was an individual named Lawrence P Vizasky. He is a pilot and also a mechanic who began working for Jeffrey Epstein back in 1991 all the way through 2019. He flew during the course of that time 3 different planes and also served with respect to installation of various home theater systems on his multiple properties. First question out of the gate from the state was what role Ghislane Maxwell, the defendant, had with Epstein, and he referred to her as being the number 2 person working underneath Jeffrey Epstein, or I guess not. And then they spent a good deal of time going through different properties, and Vizasky displayed a wealth of knowledge about multiple properties. First started describing Zorro Ranch in Mexico, then he was describing properties in Paris. The Zorro Ranch in Mexico, I mean, opulence that I guess you would expect from a billionaire, but few of us ever actually got to experience. And the state came with very well prepared, both sides here, I just want to say with respect to the attorneys, complete professional, very, very professional. The questions that were being asked by the state were spot on, like just moving along through the direct testimony. It was a little bit detailed in going through the opulence that was there before she got to anything that was really of great import, describing the exotic planes that he had and how he moved up through the years. In 1991, that he had a smaller plane, then he moved up to a Gulfstream in 1994 through 2000, and then moving up to a Boeing 727 in 2000 through 2004. He also described himself as being in control of the manifests, which, as you know, is a log of who's flying on these planes, and that whoever the captain was would basically take down that information, as well as the flight logs, which would register who went and where the flights were heading out. There was very little testimony brought out on direct with respect to actually who flew on those planes. That came out on cross, which I'll get to very shortly. The one thing that the state was using, the reason they brought her in here, and the key for the state, I believe, is that they wanted to tie in that victim who the state is identifying as Jane had actually met with the defendant, with Vizasky, the witness, in West Palm Beach, and he indicated that he recalled flying with her on at least one occasion. She's one of the victims who's identified as being one of the complainants of the defendant herein. He also identified another individual by the name of Virginia Roberts. And right after that, the state was done with their direct. The cross-examination was very crisp. It was handled by Christian Everdell, and he fixated first and foremost about the fact that the girls looked mature. In fact, he didn't even go for 18. He kept focusing on the fact that they all looked over 20, which the witness said that, yeah, the entire time, everyone who was there, he looked like they were over 20. He also described with some strong questions about what he was able to witness as far as whether there was ever any sex that was on the planes. And he was pretty firmly establishing that despite the fact that there was a closed door there, that Jeffrey Epstein never tried to hide anything from him. He invited him to use bathrooms on the back of the plane. He did frequently use bathrooms, go back to the galley to get a coffee. He never saw any type of sex, and certainly no sex with underage individuals. And he seemed to be pretty compelling in testifying to the fact that, to his knowledge, and that he would be someone who actually had knowledge as to what was going on the plane. There's sufficient access that he would think he would have had knowledge. That he was never instructed not to go to the back of the plane, and that there was actually no illicit activity actually happening on the plane itself with respect to any sexual conduct with minors. He also talked about the flight logs, and that's when we started getting to some of the big names. And when they're asking about flight logs and what preparations he would have for flight logs, so he referenced the first person that he was asked about was Bill Clinton, former President Bill Clinton, whether he flew on the plane. He said he had flown on the plane several times, and that he would be told in advance whenever Clinton would come on the plane. And the defense did a good job in trying to distinguish the defendant from Jeffrey Epstein, basically saying if she wasn't on the plane, she would have no access to the manifest. She wouldn't even know who was on the planes, in order to try and distinguish her and try and draw for the jury a picture of a person who really had nothing to do with the taint that is held by the court of public opinion with respect to the conduct of Jeffrey Epstein, even though he wasn't technically ever convicted of anything. But the opinion that the world at large has of him as being a sex trafficker, they want to distinguish that from being associated and tainted onto the defendant, Ghislane Maxwell. And that's why they're basically trying to establish that she had nothing to do with the flight log. She didn't know anything about that. And then they started planting doubt as to whether or not Jane ever flew on the plane, whether or not it was the actual Jane, which is not the complainant's real name. That's a pseudonym that the state is using in order to protect the identity of the victims. And some of the questions here, as far as his Jane and how many times she went on the plane, and he really ended up getting Vizasky to admit that he couldn't swear that she ever actually had flown on the plane. Part of the questions that the defense was asking was, frequently Jeffrey Epstein would bring people on the plane just to look around the plane, and you remember her doing that, is that correct? Yes. And then he asked him, you don't know if Jane actually flew or was just shown the plane? And he said, I don't know, I don't remember. I can't say I actually recall her sitting in the seat while we were flying. This is of critical importance with respect to the question as to whether or not Jeffrey Epstein, much less the defendant, was involved in transporting minors between state lines, which is one of the elements that the government is certainly hoping to establish here beyond a reasonable doubt. Then the cross continued by trying to plant the seed that in the brain and in the mind of the witness that it was Jane, the complainant, who actually flew. And they started asking questions like, you remember the government showing you a flight manifest with Jane's name on it? And he said, yes. And he said, 3 flights, yes. And he said, you couldn't recall if she actually flew, though. And he said, that's correct. And then he started pointing out how Jane, her real first name, that there were other people who worked for Jeffrey Epstein who shared the same first name and the same spelling. So even though there's a manifest that they showed Vizasky, which basically has the first name of the complainant, Jane, so that they say, well, there were other people who had the same exact first name who worked for Epstein who had also flown, and trying to plant the seed that perhaps it was a personal assistant who shared the exact same spelling of the first name. Maybe it was her who was flying on the plane, and that Jane never actually flew on the plane, because there is no last name associated with that Jane there. And basically trying to plant the seed that maybe it's the government which is trying to convince you and make you misremember what actually happened and believe that Jane flew on the plane. You don't actually know that it was Jane that flew on the plane herself. And trying to without directly saying, at that point at least, they weren't directly asking, you couldn't swear that it wasn't the personal assistant who was flying on those 3 individual flights or not. And he was admitting, he's like, look, I don't remember these particular flights. So I can't tell you. I mean, he flew like thousands. He threw roughly 1,000 flights or so during this time period. Then they started bringing in evidence under seal, and this is an interesting thing with respect to procedure. So there's certain pictures, most of the pictures that are not under seal, pictures of Ghislane Maxwell with the witness or with other people who are not complainants, that they allow the public to see whenever it comes to something that helps identify the actual victims. So they actually keep that under seal. They do not allow even those of us who are in the courtroom to see that. They actually have preset folders that are underneath the benches of the jury for them to pull out at certain given times. And the state or the defense will actually say, please open your folder and look at exhibit LD3 or LD4. And that's where they'll have pictures of various complainants who are alleged victims of both Epstein and the defendant, Ghislane Maxwell. Now we start coming to the juicy stuff. And the defense started asking about some big names who he flew. And here are the people he identified that he had flown. He said he had flown Bill Clinton several times. He said he flew Prince Andrew on his plane. Yes, the Prince Andrew, son of Queen Elizabeth. That he had flown Yitzhak Perlman, world-famous violinist, on the planes. Then they started asking him about other people. They asked him if he ever flew Donald Trump on his planes. He said yes, he had flown Donald Trump. He asked if he had flown members of Donald Trump's family on his plane. He said, I don't remember ever flying any family members of Donald Trump. He asked him whether he had ever flown Senator Glenn, former astronaut Senator Glenn. He said yes. Senator Mitchell, did you ever fly him? Yes. Kevin Spacey and Chris Tucker, did you ever fly them? Yes. Robert Kennedy Jr., did you ever fly them on his planes? And he said yes. Now, these are all names that many of us had heard in the past. What's interesting is that this is the first time there's direct testimony that's being given under oath about someone saying that these large names had actually flown on a plane. At least to my knowledge, it's the first time that anyone is under oath actually sworn that these individuals flew on Epstein's plane. That's about all I can give you for now on this. I'm going to sort of wrap this up here. But this is just the first several hours of the first full day of testimony, November 30th. Please make sure that you like, share, subscribe, stay tuned to my channel, share with your friends, people who you think might be interested in Ghislane Maxwell, which, let's face it, is pretty much the entire world. So share it with the world. And when you sign up, make sure you don't just subscribe, hit the bell. If you don't hit the bell, Susan is going to cut you off. You're going to miss everything. You want to risk that? Don't risk that. No one wants to risk that. I'll see you. Take care. I'll be back with the wrap-up after lunch this afternoon, or New York time would probably be evening, probably sometime around 5, 6 o'clock. Till then, Godspeed.